Welcome to another edition of Cults and the Culting of America. My name is Scot Loyd, along with my friend, the knitting cult lady, Daniela Mestyanek-Young. Daniela, good to see you once again.
Thanks. Good to see you. And I finished my book today.
Congratulations. And for those that perhaps don't know, why don't you give a quick preview of what that is?
Yeah, so it's called The Culting of America. I've been working on it for about 2.5 years, and it is my, definition of cult that I've defined in 10 parts that we, spent the first 10 episodes of this podcast talking about. And for each of those parts of group behavior, I take you through cults, right? Where we can see it for real in cults, but then also where we can see it in the US military and in America, like regular American groups. And, I'm excited for today's interviews because one of the things, as soon as you hang out your shingle as a cult expert, right? It's basically as soon as you define cult, you're going to be asked two questions. What about the military and what about AA? And just that to me is so significant.
Absolutely. And speaking of which, our guest this evening, Andi Wiseman, so glad that you're able to join us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Scott and Daniela. I'm really excited and grateful to be here and to chat with you both.
Absolutely. And this was kind of a first for me. I never get any traction over on LinkedIn, but Andi reached out to me on LinkedIn. So how cool is that, Daniela, that she discovered our podcast and reached out to me and wanted to share her story. And I'm so glad that you did. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Scott. Is this where I should probably introduce myself or something?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Tell us about yourself.
Who am I and why did I reach out to you at all? Well, my name is Andi Wiseman. I'm dialing in today from the west coast of British Columbia in Canada. So, hello. And I've been working in the front lines of nonprofit for about 30 years now in the mental health and addictions field. And I came across your podcast about a month ago, and it just really resonates with me. I've always been fascinated by cults and group behavior. I've always said that if I was able to have gone to school and gotten a degree, it probably would have been in sociology and psychology. Like that's where my brain naturally goes. And so when I first heard the conversations that both of you were having, I was like, oh my God, that's like the Noam Chomsky of cults, right? Like it just absolutely landed in a really powerful and impactful way for me. And I'm aware that AA is long compared to cult in terms of tactics and sort of the group, and I'm pretty familiar with it. I've had my own experiences going through that program, and I recently wrote a book where I've rewritten the 12 steps to make them more inclusive and less culty. Basically. And so that's where I felt that maybe we had a good opportunity for a pretty cool conversation.
Absolutely. And Daniela, I know that you often catch flack, not only from the Bernie bros, but from the AA folks as well, because this is a point of contention when people discover your material. I feel like a lot of folks are with you until you bring up the group that they're aligned with, right?
Oh yeah, now I just joke that like nobody likes to have the cult eye turned on them, like even Daniela the person is going to get knitting cult ladies cult eye turned on her, but it's really interesting because actually I mentioned finishing my book today, right? And one of the things I say in the end is, I don't know the answers, right? People act like because I can diagnose toxic groups, then I know the answer for good groups. And like, I don't. And when people ask me, oh, right, so what's the answer to addiction? And it's like, first of all, I don't know, right? I'm a cult scholar and a trauma survivor. But like, I should be part of this conversation, but I'm not the whole answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also think it goes deeper than that. And I think what my experience in so many ways has taught me is that people want an easy answer, a nice, tidy, clean, easy answer, right? They don't want to hear well, it's probably related to trauma, right? It probably involves therapy. It probably is going to cost some money. And there's probably going to be a huge element of community support. And the fact that we don't have better systems and groups should be part of that conversation. But that's not what people want. They want to hear, here's a group. This lady has said it's safe. Go forth. So anyway, all this to say, I love the concept of your book, and I'm so interested to
Thank you so
hear
much.
like what you discovered in like rewriting this or kind of pulling this apart from the addiction specialist side.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's I mean, I'll say book is kind of generous. It's about a 20-minute read. And really, I just happened to have a couple of weeks and I decided to put down on paper things that I've been harping about in my advocacy and in my professional life for about 20 years. But certainly it's satirical, but it's also very serious. And I really believe that it's an important bit of content for folks that for whom this program does not work. And I think it's important socially to just take opportunity to unpack the dominance that 12-step modules have on treatment and the conflation of their vernacular and their language and their culture with treatment and recovery. And so that was the impetus and that was the intention behind the book. I'm not a researcher by trade, but I've certainly worked and experienced my own life enough to know that I think all the evidence shows it's about 5% quote success rate. Usually most people touch base into an AA or 12-step program for many, many reasons. It again has dominated the whole narrative since 1935, and courts mandate folks into the program, and most programs, most governments, most states absolutely bankroll these programs to roll out. And so it's really difficult when it doesn't work for people. And I would say that's most people because it's essentially a religious construct, right? And so not to take away, like it works for the people that it works for. What I've always noticed and experienced myself, I was, I think 20 years old when I came out of detox and ended up in a residential 12-step program. And I was asking questions, and that's not good. And there, there's a lot of hypocrisy. I remember being in rooms and being just very vulnerable, all the things that you've both sort of touched on. Typically any group that people are drawn to when they're vulnerable, it's about belonging and connection. And so, yeah, you're not supposed to really ask questions. And I remember like back then you could smoke in places and I'd be like, but a cigarette is a drug. So like what, and it's like, don't talk about that. Right. And so like, I've experienced that, in religion as well. Like you're just not supposed to ask a lot of questions. And, I always kind of like have, and that's, I guess, like why I don't really have friends now, and that's fine. But all of which is to say, I think that really what's become extremely harmful is, sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I think we might have a little delay.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just saying, what was I saying? I think that what's extremely, what I've seen and observed, like in my personal life and in my professional life, is the message that, like if the program's not working for you, it's because of you. Is extremely harmful because it's not a clinical program. Like it's not treatment, it's peer support. And so the conflation of that with treatment, and then this like core message that if you are not experiencing what everybody else is telling you is success, which is 100% sobriety and all of the things that's like, there's lots of mantras, all the things that you've both touched on, then it's because of you. And really, I think that it's kind of reduced the idea that recovery from addiction is just this many days so-called clean, which makes me crazy because it implies dirty, right? So there's just not a lot of room for stuff, and it's extremely harmful. And I've seen people like not survive that, right? because as we know, we all need
Yeah.
connection. And so, you know,
Well, and so this is what I always want to make very clear for my audience, right? Because when we say it doesn't work for everyone, people really want to say, well, what's the harm? It works for some, right? And this is where
mhm,
I like to be very clear. It's like, no, it harms many of the people that it doesn't work for, just like any cult, right? It causes suicides, it causes overdoses, it comes in with purity, messaging, like you have to give all or nothing.
mhm,
And not to
mhm.
even bring in 13th step and kind of the sexual abuse, but yes, to bring it in, right? And this is like
Oh, I was
where I
gonna,
come
you
in with
weren't.
like, okay, the children of God, this is where I come in with like,
Mhm,
okay, the children of God got people sober. They literally called it getting high on Jesus, right? Pick up addicts, get them high on
mhm,
the group. And that would have been fine if all they did was go be high on Jesus together, but they didn't. They raped children,
mhm,
right? Like there's real harm attached to these things. And part of why I bring up like the military and AA together, there's so many parallels, but one of them is like society doesn't want to have that question. We don't want to have that question, those hard questions about what to do. So we just say, well, this cult seems to work. Let's throw our people
mhm.
there. And so people will force themselves to stay when it's not working because nothing works for everyone. Like, do we really have to say that in 2025? Um, but,
Apparently we
people
do.
will force themselves to stay. And I just want to say I'm writing a musical and I just rhymed 12 steps with jails, institutions, and death. So I'm very proud of myself.
Oh, best. I mean, that's the other like deeply harmful mantra in the program, right? Is that there it's all or nothing thinking. I mean, it's long. I'm certainly not the first to bring this up. The
Yeah.
first book that I ever read about it was by a fellow named Chaz Buf, who wrote a book, I think it was like maybe in the late 80s, called AA, Cult or Cure. And so he did a fantastic job, in my opinion, of just really outlining in many of the similar ways that you do, Daniela, with like just cut and dry, like this is cult like behavior and this is cult like tactics and
Mm-hmm.
this is the similarities between what we know about cults. And so I think that's just carried through.
Yeah.
I remember in the 80s there weren't really anything other than Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and then sort of late 80s through the 90s there were lots of spin-offs. So you have like your Buddhist 12 steps and like all kind like overeaters. They just sort of
Yeah.
like 12-step model just went to everything that can be problematic, up to and including Emotions Anonymous, which I was always really amused by because I'm like, okay, come on, seriously. So it's just kind of like, I don't know how much of it is
Yeah.
like opportunistic. I don't know how much is capitalism. I don't like it just, but in terms of the narrative, as the human beings that are in this world where this is presented to us, it's still very, very dominant. And courts actually mandate
Mm-hmm.
people. And so you have these rooms that are largely unregulated. I always found it really interesting that one of the founders, Bill W., based the whole structure of the program on this anonymity principle. And I always found it really interesting. It was almost similar to like anarchistic in that there was to be no one that could have personal gain from membership or involvement in this group. But as we know, like anytime two or more humans get together, like, even a great idea can
Mm-hmm.
just go really left,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so
And we
it
also know that he died personally wealthy, so and
yeah, I
this is
mean,
I think
to
one
say
of these.
nothing of very privileged white Christian men. The whole group is very influenced by a group called the Oxford Group that was founded by a Lutheran minister in like 1930 or something. And so it's all
Mm-hmm.
really anchored in evangelism and this idea of fellowship, and the thing that ails you can be cured. It's a spiritual malady. And so there's a surrender to God. Like that's sort of the core. And so I think somewhere in the 90s, someone was like, oh, well, you don't have to call it God, you can call it higher power. But the end of the day, again, it's not clinical. We know that addiction is absolutely rooted in trauma. It's rooted in a lot of political like realities, like in terms of social determinants of health. There's no housing, there's no education, there's no access to healthcare, there's no like all of the things, right? And so, I mean, the other interesting thing is that Bill W. is very clear. I think it's Tradition 10, where it's like the group absolutely has no political viewpoint at all and will not make a statement one way or the other about any sort of quote anything controversial. And so to have humans in this day and age literally sometimes court mandated into these rooms, and to have that be the anchor in terms of trying to address, you know, whatever they're self-medicating is like, I know I'm not alone in thinking it's extremely problematic and very, very harmful. Don't even get me started on the 13th stiffing, right? And I mean, I think that it's a like a microcosm of everything that like then seeps out into the sector of nonprofit work that I've worked in for a long, long time, which is mental health and addictions, right? Because you have people come up through these programs and then they're like the practitioners and the helpers that work for me, it can work for you. You just got like it just kind of, it's like generational trauma, but like generational, I don't know, cultiness, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and also because you mentioned generational trauma, right? Like the very real victims of cults are often the children. And this is because of this cult
Mm-hmm.
tactic of guaranteeing you that you are right to put your children under the mission, right? To put the mission
Mm-hmm.
above your children. And this is one of those things that where I'm like, now I'm like, yes, I'm a sociologist. I've studied this for years. I know what I'm talking about. But as soon as I started looking
Mm-hmm.
into AA, I found that the children of steppers have cult baby stories, right? You
Mm-hmm.
know what it's like to have your parents put their mission above everything. And that's like, to me, is one of the things that's so frustrating about talking to them, because it kind of triggers all of my cult baby traumas of like the parents are so wound up in their mission that they don't get it at all, you know. They'll literally look at you
What?
and be like, well, if you don't put it in front of your children, you'll lose. And I'm like, if I had stage 4 cancer right now and I had 12 days left to live and I was putting myself and my treatment in front of that 9-year-old girl upstairs, I would be an absolute asshole. Like, you know, but it's
Yeah,
just
I think.
like, I don't care why you say it or why you justify it, but that experience of being a child and your parent willing to let harm happen to you because of the mission, right? Like Scott and I have
Mm-hmm.
both had that, even though we grew up in very different cults.
Well, and you talk very eloquently, and I know you've written very eloquently about just that, right? Harm is apparently relative and subjective, right? And so what's harmful to one is like redemptive to another. I don't know. I mean, one of the other things I found myself reflecting on when I was thinking about this amazing conversation that we're getting to have right now is some of my own experiences in terms of what I've experienced as sort of culty in my life. And I think it was your inaugural episode, Daniela, when you talked about when you left Children of God, how the like, and I've been kind of just geeking out and sort of pseudo studying cults for probably about 25 years, like long before podcasts and Netflix. It was like HBO documentaries on like, you know, the underground pipeline to help women and girls get out of like the polygamous cults and things, right? And so you I've become very familiar with this experience, and I've also worked with a lot of women. Like I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of women, like leaving different situations, and so you land in the world, and you've lost your worldview, and you've lost your community, and you've lost your family, and it's very scary and terrifying and isolating, and kind of like, I think you described it as a kind of death almost, and so that really resonated with me. For myself, you know, I had a pretty unremarkable childhood, except that it was extremely neglectful. And so I ended up in state care in Canada. And so I sort of, like the system was my parent, like the state was my parent. And I've kind of clocked this a little more and more in my adulthood, that that's not the case for everyone. So I tend to think and breathe in systems, which is probably why I'm kind of interested in group psychology and the way that, humans organize themselves and how that translates into systems, right? And laws and policy and legislation. And so when I aged out, it was exactly for me like very similar, at least, and what you described. Like I was 19 years old. Back then in Canada, what would happen is they would what they called age you out, and so they give you a welfare check, and that was kind of like it. Right? And so for me, when I reflect on that, like being 19 years old, I lost my first born child. She was 18 months old at the time to coerced adoption. So that the last care provider that I had was able to do that. And so then I'm like 20 years old and 19 years old and self-medicating. And the difference being that I never really had a worldview or a family to begin with. And so when I think about myself as always having been a seeker, it's because I've worked with so many people that have to unlearn toxic family of origin stuff. And for me, the toxicity was just pure neglect. And so there's almost a real freedom in that because I kind of like no one told me anything. So it's just kind of like then you just start to grasp, and there's vulnerability in that. And it's been really brutal and hard and all the things. I ended up in like abusive relationships. I mean, it's very textbook after that. I ended up with someone who weaponized the family courts for 10 years. So I needed to like play lawyer and sort of fight with my kid for a long time. And so I've just kind of like gone through these very, not high control environments, but the system has always had massive control in my life. And I'm in my 50s now, and I'm still in the consequences of that. Like I'm still one paycheck away from homelessness, all the things get very textbook for me. And so, yeah, I kind of, it's just sort of added to my lens, right? So yeah, anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing your story. I'm sorry that you had to endure all of that, but it seems that now you're in a position where, for those that have experienced similar, you're able to help them, and so kudos to you for doing a good job in helping others. And I think that's what the spirit of our program is all about, right? Right. What we do here is we share information in the hopes that other people can benefit from it and find perhaps inspiration, but more than inspiration, right? Actual tools that they can use to get away from these particular groups.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I mean, I appreciate that. It's interesting how, like having worked in nonprofit for so long, I don't have a master's degree. I didn't graduate from high school, and I just kind of like I have the blessing of just being an avid reader and being able to parse a sentence, and it's a system where like it's very colonial, and so things are written. Needing to play my own lawyer for a long time, like it didn't get me the outcome that I needed and deserved, but I certainly lasted 10 years in family courts, and I've worked with lots of folks where it's just it's too tall an order, right? Like I can kind of keep up with the systems because I've grown up in them, and it's this weird advantage kind of. But yeah, my own experiences always drove my choices. Having no self-esteem and just sort of from go, having the core message that you don't have worth. So then it just sort of lends to that codependency and vulnerability, which I know you guys have both talked about very eloquently. Like that's the vulnerability that cults in particular or high control groups draw on. And I sort of, after the amount of time that I've spent in nonprofit, I've really started to understand how damaging it's been for me personally, I would say. And I think that I've observed for a long time, it's a sector that tends to really attract folks with histories of trauma. Like we want to help, right? For me, I came up as an activist, and so it was like, I'm anti-capitalist, nonprofit, good enough. I don't, I want to give my time and energy to something that's not capitalist. In hindsight, I regret it because I've done just hundreds of thousands of free hours of work, right? And I ended up in a lot of ways inadvertently being tokenized as a person with like lived experience that could like, check those boxes that can be very performative in this sector. I'm just starting to really, in my 50s now, see this really specific dance that the state and nonprofits have, and how ultimately the core issues don't ever substantively change without massive upheaval. Kind of like what I think might be going on in your country now. And I hope you're both okay. We're all a little concerned. But anyway, I hope that makes sense. But I know, Danielle, I think I heard you mention you've worked nonprofit as well. And I was kind of really interested to hear a little more about what your thoughts on that were in terms of the cultiness of like nonprofit, right?
Yeah. So not only did I work in a nonprofit, but it was a veteran entrepreneurship nonprofit that personally got swallowed up by WeWork. So
Okay.
like I got a seat to just like all the culting, and I ran it for free for 2 years. Like when you're talking about like the labor, right? The stuff. And by the way, I just found research that I put in the end of Culting of America where like we actually feel justified letting people's labor be exploited if it's something they're passionate about.
Absolutely.
And
God.
but something I think that you mentioned that's so valuable is like you understand these systems because you grew up inside of them. And this is something that's really so relevant for my audience right now. It's like we all understand coercive control because we grew up inside of it, which means it sucks what's going on right now. And we're very triggered and we're very angry, right? And still like dealing with our own survival from being damaged from these systems. But we also have a ton of life skills. Like when cult babies go into the military or their government, like we're really, really good because we understand this game and how to play it. And that's both good and bad, right? But I think what you're discovering, I think what a lot of us are discovering, like when you said you were the person with lived experience, and then I'm like, oh yeah. And then the cult just wants you to flay yourself open all the time to trot out your experience, right? And like, I've found I can do that when I'm doing it for me and when I know why I'm doing it. But I think, I went into even organizational psychology for much the same reason that you went into nonprofits. It's like, I understand why these groups suck and I want to help fix them. And ultimately, I've decided individual action's not going to do it, and I don't know if they want to be fixed. Part of I think the problem in America that we are having right now is we've convinced ourselves that individual action can fix systemic problems. Like a big reason that we have cults is because of American culture and what we do. But another big reason is because our country actively fought against protections and, other systemic things that would help cult survivors. So we're sitting here saying like it's all on us to learn and avoid the damage. And this brings me back full circle to AA when people will like look me full in the face and they'll be like, oh no, you just have to find the right meeting. Like you're telling me that an addict at their lowest point has to find the right meeting that is safe for them. You're not a good organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
They say the same thing in the military. They told me the same thing in the cult. Like my problems were never, it was me or it was don't judge us by this unit, right? Go somewhere else. Like, oh, you have to watch out for the colonel. Like individual has to watch out for these systemic bad things instead of just stopping and saying like, no, the
Mhm.
system is bad.
Yeah, absolutely, Danielle. And I like my experience in AA as a 19 or 20-year-old was when I just asked too many questions and it just wasn't working for me, and I left, and the person at the door said, "You're going to die without this program." And then I ended up running that organization for the better part of 10 years later in my life, right? Um so it's just this very deficit based, like fear based messaging. You cannot do this without this program. What I've come to learn over the years is that there's just, I mean, and just as a side, like addiction is not just drugs and alcohol. Like I have been a workaholic, right? Like after, I was abstinent for 10 years and then I threw myself into work. I used to work 100-hour weeks. My daughter bore the worst brunt of that. Other, you know, things aside, violent relationship, all things. But like work addiction, sex addictions, shopping addiction, gambling, gadgets, like it's all addiction, even hoarding or, just the synapses are the same. And so I find myself personally really frustrated that the public narrative about addiction is just the folks that are visibly struggling the most, the ones that are unhoused, the ones that have untreated mental health, and the ones that self-medicate with unregulated drugs. They are the sort of image and the narrative and the chattel for just these just the narrative and so when I wrote my book, it was kind of like to try and open that up as well. Like recovery can be from anything in any way. Harm reduction has value. Sometimes people recover with reduction. It's not just teetotaling. It's not just 100% abstinence. It's not that like I have this many days clean. Many folks consider themselves in recovery, and the recovery isn't based on an identity that's anchored completely in what I used to be and what I no longer am. you know which is a big facet of AA that I've always observed. Most of the folks that are very devout and for whom the program works very, very well, it's all about I am this many days clean. I used to be this. I used to be this horrible, and now I'm not. The other thing, because it's not political and there's no room for any conversation or sort of space for anything political, it's very white. There's a lot of privilege, I've noticed, right? And now that there's no real anonymity because of social media, and the rooms are pretty out in the open, and there's like hashtags. I think I want to say the mid 2000s, there was a little blip where I think someone produced a film called The Anonymous Folks or something. And so there was a real sort of schism that happened within sort of the program, or at least the part of the program that I had was privy to in my work, where folks were like, no, being anonymous sort of contributes to stigma. So we need to be like out loud and proud in our recovery. And so some folks, there's a little bit of a schism where some are like, no, anonymity, absolutely. Others are like, no, out and loud and proud about our recovery and being recovered addicts. And from my perspective, it's always been like I've worked with criminalized and marginalized folks for 30 years. And for many of us, there's risks to being out and loud. Like there's privilege in being able to put your hand up in a public space and identify as being in recovery. It's kind of like similar to, I've worked for sex worker rights for a long time. There's a lot of criticism about sex worker rights movement. It's huge in Canada. It's also very white. I worked for a while for an organization that works with immigrant and migrant sex workers, and it's a deportable offense, right? Because of the sort of structural racism of our immigration system. And so that community absolutely cannot be out and loud and proud about their sex work because they will be arrested, detained, and deported. And so there's like this whiteness that sort of runs through this very like public facing, selfie driven sort of being out about whatever it is that I find a lot of folks don't really talk about. And for those of us that do,
Yeah.
it's not really a popular space. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, and also, this is where I also think like zooming out sometimes helps too, which is like all cults justify their secrecy. And all secrecy
Mhm.
is used to cover up bad behavior. And that is what I believe a lot of it is used for in AA. Like bad behavior, stop people from seeing patterns, all of that. But that doesn't mean it's an all or nothing, right? Again, even that debate of like, oh, we have to be anonymous or everyone has to be out and proud. Like, no, stop. That's a cult. Everyone doesn't have to have the exact same, like, and it, oh,
Absolutely. I've said for years, there's a million ways that someone can end up struggling with any kind of alcohol abuse or drug abuse or workaholism or anything, right? And so why on earth would one um, cure be the answer, right? And that I know you've spoken eloquently about that. I've noticed that over the years too. Cults seem to always say we have the answer. The thing where the state comes in with nonprofit work and sort of things like addiction and mental health and other sort of social determinants of health is the state, it's not a pipeline, so it's not going to make money. And so the state really likes sort of the biggest bang for your buck. And that's where you get like people that are, working 100-hour weeks and not being paid very much because the system itself is going to exploit passion and dedication to just causes, right? And social justice. And so that's kind of just baked in, you know?
Andy, you said something really interesting that I want to follow up on. You talked about the religious overtones of groups like AA, and we've touched on that before. But I remember growing up in my particular religious group that was a high control group, was a cult.
Mhm.
And I remember our first interactions with groups like AA. And it's like one
Mhm.
cult started attacking another cult because the religious leaders and the religious folks that I were around, they were really upset when somebody would talk about recovery. I remember the Christianized version or the church version of an AA group. It was branded and marketed as Celebrate Recovery. And I remember
Mhm.
one elderly gentleman in my church that actually got offended by that title because, in our tradition, it wasn't about recovery, it was about deliverance. And so identifying for a prolonged time as a recovering addict, we didn't have a space for that in our particular group. So I don't really have a question, but it was just interesting the observation how sometimes these groups start to attack one another for different reasons, but it's almost like their territory is being
Mhm.
infringed upon, right, by another group.
Absolutely, Scott. I really appreciate that. And I see it time and time again. I mean, um, yeah, the splitting hairs, the semantics, right? I think it's
and
one thing, not to minimize. I mean, faith is faith, right? Like I've been
Right.
pegged for a long time as being anti-AA, and I'm certainly not. What I take issue with is that it is offered and packaged and state um, backed as the single solution, and that's incredibly harmful for any number of the reasons that we've already talked about. I'm like, if it works for you, great, but I think any good policy needs to give the most opportunity to the widest number of people, and we just know that it's like 5% are going to experience
Yeah.
success and wellness through this
And
program,
when
and
it's
so what
when
about
it's
the other
backed up, yeah, and when it's backed up by the state, as it was in my particular state that I was in, I was actually leading a church. I was a pastor of a
Mhm.
church, and we had these types of programs going on. And I
Mhm.
remember I was part of the ministerial alliance, so I sat on a board
Mhm.
with other pastors in the community, and we had to lead a fight against the magistrates, against the judges in the community, because come to find out, the judge that was sentencing people to
Mhm.
these particular programs and where they had to go and do their community service to work off their hours for being punished,
Mhm.
the judge's wife was getting a kickback from
Mhm.
particular businesses in the community that would provide this free labor. And when these poor folks would get in the system, they couldn't get out, right? So if they missed a court date, or if they didn't show up when they said they were supposed to, they were hauled off to jail. And so if they had a job, they would lose it. And so we were actually put in a position where we had to challenge the judge in the community, because he had a system going where he was benefiting off the backs of these poor addicted folks.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've seen it for many, many years. I've experienced it. I mean, like I said, when I was 19, I was put onto welfare. Most of I don't know. I imagine it's not too different in the United States. In Canada, if you're seeing unhoused people, a good percentage of them are folks that came up through state care, right? Because you end up in, as a young adult with no place to go and no family to fall back on. Also, I mean, a quick aside, I've long concluded that you can't have wealth without poverty. And so poverty never really substantively goes away, because functionally there's a reason that poverty exists. And so all of these people are serving a systemic function, both in terms of stigma, scapegoating, just easy chattel for all of the sorry, I'm trying not to swear, all the terrible narratives, right? Fodder for, cop shows, whatever it is, right? But also politically, I mean, I think that it's a little naive to think that folks, heavy hitters and high rollers in these industries don't have vested interests, right? It's like we know that lobbyists kind of sort of run things. Often, and the addiction and mental health industry is not any different. I think it comes down to the people who are doing it. Like, you're either in it for the right reasons, or you're in it for the money, or whatever it is. And so right now in Canada, there's a real push for involuntary treatment, which is horrifying from a human perspective. We know it's just jail light. It's going to impact marginalized communities, people of color, Indigenous folks, all of the people who have the least advantage and who are most systemically oppressed are going to end up being thrown into involuntary treatment. It's generally white folks that are propping this. It's white folks who own the private treatment centers that will take the state contracts to do this ostensibly benevolent thing of just locking people up until they can love themselves and clean up, right? And frankly, just while I'm at it, it kind of abhors me that the folks that are leading this charge, again, they're really in tight with government. It's being pushed quite hard right now. We're, I think 12 years into a fentanyl crisis in Canada. I don't know, a year ago it was 21 people a day that were dying from unregulated drugs. And so what these proponents tend to do is they go to recently bereaved parents, and they'll say, if you could, take your loved one and lock them up and put them through involuntary treatment to save their life, would you? And I find that really abhorrent personally, to manipulate grieving people in that way, right? But again, that's the optics versus the reality. There's huge contracts at stake, and
this is all tactics of cults, and this is all tactics of cults, right? Manipulating grief-stricken, bereaved people. And
absolutely.
Here was something that stood out to me too, that's this underlying thing of cults. Like, when you were like, I've been pegged as anti-AA, right? So have I. So what? Does that make any of the arguments invalid? I only get this with AA and the military, and now kind of with Bernie Bros, right?
Yeah.
When I critique Scientology, no one's like, is the knitting cult lady anti-Scientology, right? Like, I don't have to defend this with any other group. And I've had this fight so often with the military. And they're like, so are you a disgruntled veteran, or are you proud? I'm both.
Yeah.
And by the way, this idea that we don't listen to cult survivors or survivors because they're disgruntled, because they have an agenda, it's called knowledge. That idea comes to us from the cult wars. I'm sure it comes from other places, but it comes from the cult wars, where academics and religious leaders worked very, very hard in America and Canada, because you have several of the cult people in Canada,
Yes,
to say that we don't listen. We don't listen to cult survivors. We see this in America. We don't pay documentary people for giving us their story, because otherwise we believe you're biased, right? So I can write a whole book and sell my life story, and I do, but like I can't get paid on a documentary. And that's like, this is this American cultural thing, and it didn't come from nowhere. It came from religious leaders, and I'm sure AA leaders were a part of this in the 1970s and 80s, shutting down critique and specifically mounting a war against listening to survivors for the problems. And this is why, like, especially now that I'm done my book, like, y'all are about to hear me get really unsufferable, because I'm like, and I'm going to say unsufferable instead of insufferable, you know, like, no, I lived it. And then I read all the stuff, just like you were saying, right? Like, you read all the stuff by all the smart people, but like, here's this other perspective. And cults don't want you to listen to that, right? And there's always an agenda, I think, with people that don't want you to listen, especially when it's negative stories. Right. And this is, you know, one of the things about AA is like, you can't criticize it unless you can't lose your job. You know,
absolutely.
That's a red flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and then it gets really complicated, right? Like, I worked for 12-step program for 12 years and never really came out until I resigned as identifying that I'm in recovery, although the program doesn't consider that I am, because I don't practice abstinence, right? And so a lot of my sort of work with people is to sort of up the harm reduction and just promote, like, you're in your body, like you're in your life, like, you know what you need, and this can be helpful, and you don't need to subscribe for the rest of your life, like, for most people. And there's no room in the public conversation. Most people end up sort of touching base in AA kind of through court, or just when they first, you know, whatever. And then they kind of move on, like, it's helpful. And then it's kind of like any sort of relationships, right? And so I find it difficult that their experiences aren't as valued, do you know? And so, that's kind of my mission.
Yeah.
To get unpopular.
And I want to like double down on
opinions.
this. I want to really double down on this point that you made of like, you know what you need. If you do the work, you know what you need. And this is kind of where I finished my book, where I was like, we're not going to solve groups and systems today, ladies and gentlemen. So what I've decided that I can do is I can help you kind of like pay attention to that voice, right? Like, the next time you hear that the boss is requiring women to wear pantyhose and you think to yourself, that's creepy, you'll listen to yourself, you know? And it's just like, I've never been asked the question in good faith, is X group a cult? And looked at it and been like, nah, nothing. You know, like, as a Swiftie, I'm not the one going around saying our Swiftie is a cult, you know, like, if there's nothing there, people aren't asking that question, right? So if you're feeling coerced, and this is why I think people find cult content and trauma content, it's like trying to understand. When people tell me they love my stuff, I'm just like, you too have coercive control in your life or your background, you know, even if you haven't really realized it yet.
Well, absolutely, Daniela. And I mean, most, I don't know. I haven't met anyone who hasn't experienced trauma. I hear some of those folks exist. I don't know them in my life, right? It only, to me, ever seems to be degrees of. Obviously, you and Scott had some pretty extreme experiences. I would think that my experiences with the system might be considered extreme. But what I've really appreciated, something that you said, Danielle, or just the idea that it's less about like this is a cult and more about identifying what the tactics are and what the psychology of it is. And for me, that's where I really like my mind was blown when I first um, encountered your podcast, because that's the place that I've kind of been focused on for a long, long time. I'm old enough that I used to like, I remember when podcasts didn't exist. Like in the early 90s, my mentors were like Noam Chomsky and Michael Parenti and Lloyd Ivans and all of and they talked about systems and psychology in similar ways that you and Scott do, right? Like it's just understanding sort of the core psychology of things and how it applies in varying degrees to various things and spaces, right? And so that's where I've been recognizing in recent years, like nonprofits, like, oh, this is some of that. It's kind of like there's some degrees of that. It's different than it rolls out in AA, but certainly we have our own vernacular. There's kind of like stuff that you fall in over years, you understand. It's this dance that you have with the state, very, particularly in community service nonprofits. I've never worked in sort of like arts or cultural nonprofits. And so coming from a grassroots lens, like, yeah, you got to kind of get into this pretty toxic dance with the state to get money to try and do good in the world, right? And it feels kind of really restrictive and high control and culty in many ways.
And it privileges the people that know how to dance. Right? And so I talk about this
Absolutely.
from a veteran perspective all the time. Like, my husband and I are quite successful because we are ringing the United States government and veteran system for every single thing it has. And I got paid for all of my PTSD because I'm a writer, right? Like, because I know how to work this system. And I say this just about the veteran medical appointments. When you have to go get coached to talk about your own body so that the system can understand what you mean, like the system's broken, right? If you have to know how to navigate the system in order to have the quote unquote average experience or the intended experience, like the system's problematic, and we need to be talking about it, and we need to be tearing into it. Like, I don't care if you want to look at it from the perspective of like AA saved your life. Great. Then I hope you're devoted to making sure that every part of it is like pulled out and aired out and held up to the light so that other people can have this life-saving experience, right? Or like you want to talk about the harms, but like, shutting down conversations because something is the sacred moose, like, I just
Yeah.
can't do it anymore.
And that's why
Oh,
these
if you're not
conversations are so important. That's why these conversations are so important. And Andy, what you do, Daniela, what you do. I was reading today, a lot of people have the misconception when they look at what happened in World War II in Nazi Germany. And of course, Nazism was a full-on cult that took control of the state. And we have our own cults here in the United States, systemic cults. We've talked about them on this program, white supremacy, the patriarchy, all of those ideas. And I was reading about this concept. It's not original with me, but the banality of evil, that, it wasn't people in the Nazi system that had the grand plan. That was perhaps was Hitler, but those bureaucrats that were a part of the system that found effective ways and efficient ways to kill large numbers of people. They weren't thinking in terms of what they were doing was wrong, but it was part of the system. It was part of the normal way of life for those that became committed to the cause of Nazism. Everyday ordinary people who got caught up in this idea and stopped thinking. And that's what these groups tend to do, is they turn off thought. Andy, one of your first experiences, they stopped you from asking questions or sort of ostracized you. And we've all had that experience, right? Because the number one enemy of the cult is people who think for themselves.
Yeah, you cannot question. Absolutely. And I think I love how you've both distinguished, like, some folks sort of start with good intentions and then it sort of takes off, and other folks kind of, take advantage and sort of it turns nefarious. But sometimes there's just straight agendas from the start, as we know, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And
Andi, tell us a little bit.
And talking about agendas is fine, right? Speaking of which, how do people find you? How do people buy your book?
Yes.
I hope you're selling it, because if you're not, we're going to have words.
You know what? I am an independent author. I do all my own marketing, and I can't afford much promotion. I just use social media, but here I brought it. I borrowed it. I don't know if this is going to be backwards. It's called The Unsubtle Art of Unfucking Your Life. I have a website. It's www.misfitmusings.com. There's some other writing that I've done on there. There's a page dedicated to the book. It's available on Amazon. And I basically give it away in exchange for honest reviews. It's landing well with the people for whom I wrote it. I know there's a real big space for this idea that that recovery is more than what AA defines it to be. And yeah, so please buy it. Drop a line. I'm on socials, and I love to hear from folks. Yeah.
But check out her book. Please buy it if you can afford it, and don't ask for her to give it away in exchange for good reviews. Let's leave that for the people who do need it.
Old habits.
Thank you.
Please just take it.
It's okay. I'm going to buy it and read it, and then you and I should talk, because I am very into marketing and good at selling books on social media that are helpful to people. So Scot's also working on a book,
so
which
much,
we're
Daniela
all like very excited about now. Thanks for reaching out and for this open, interesting conversation.
I hope it's the first of many. I have an intention to write another book, and my biggest goal right now is to maybe figure out how to work a little less. I'm still working like 5 days a week right now. But I'm just so grateful for you both, and I hope we can sort of stay in touch, and just, anyone's welcome to contact me anytime. I love to have these conversations and dialogues with folks, and just to be supportive for folks who need some help. Yeah. So
Andi, thank you so much. We're thrilled and honored to have you, and we look forward to having you back in the future. So ditto to everything that Daniela said. If you're listening to the program, be sure and like and subscribe, share with your friends and neighbors, leave us a review that helps with the algorithm. And special thanks to Haley, our producer. They always do a tremendous job in communicating with our guests and making sure everything runs smoothly. So Haley, thank you so much. I'm Scot Loyd for Daniela Mestyanek-Young, the Knitting Cult Lady. We'll see you on the next episode of Cults and the Culting of America.
Thank you.